Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is David Livingston and I'm a Deputy Director here in our Global Energy Center, where I lead our work on advanced energy and climate change. It is truly a pleasure to be able to host today the U.S. launch of the Global CCS Status Report, and we are grateful and thankful for the collaboration and the support of the Global CCS Institute in making today's event possible. Today's discussion is a timely and consequential one. There is no scenario produced by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in which the world economy achieves comprehensive decarbonization without a significant role to be played by carbon capture, storage, and/or utilization. And so, while there is still plenty of discussion to be had in the years ahead over what exactly that role might be and how carbon capture will fit into the broader portfolio of decarbonization strategies, it is increasingly clear that the world cannot afford for CCS to not be available as an option in the climate policy toolkit. But, as with so many innovative clean energy technologies, the imperative for further development of carbon capture is not only related to climate policy, but increasingly tied to geoeconomic considerations as well. Global clean energy investment has easily exceeded $300 billion for 5 years running, and clean energy now accounts for the majority of global energy investment every year. The countries, companies, and creators that develop truly competitive, scalable CCS projects will be well positioned to compete in potentially enormous markets for carbon capture technology, particularly in developing countries where the average age of fossil fuel infrastructure is still quite young. Today, against this backdrop, we will learn more about the current state of CCS technology, the status of projects around the world, and whether the early U.S. edge in CCS technology is at risk of being lost, or is instead simply gearing up for a new phase of revitalization, reinvestment, and advancement. I would also encourage you, those of you who are in the room, as well as those of you around the world who are joining us via webcast, to join the conversation live during this event by tweeting at us at AC Global Energy. Again, that's at AC Global Energy with your thoughts, your questions. We'll try and pull those in and have them featured throughout today's event. And with that, it is now my pleasure to hand things off for the next session of today's event to Galore Turan, Program Manager at the Global CCS Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is Galore Turan, and I lead the advocacy efforts with the Global CCS Institute. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here in front of this distinguished crowd, and I would very much like to thank the Atlantic Council and David for hosting us here today. For those of you who are perhaps not very familiar with us, the Global CCS Institute is an international think tank supported by governments, including the government of the United States, companies, and NGOs. And our mission is to accelerate the deployment of global CCS globally. We do this by undertaking fact-based advocacy, by encouraging knowledge sharing between our members, and by thought leadership. The Institute was launched during the G8 meeting in Italy back in 2009, and since then we have expanded and we have offices in 7 countries, including 1 here in Washington, D.C. and headquarters in Melbourne. Every year, the Institute releases its flagship report, The Status of Global CCS, at the biggest international climate gathering of the year, UN's Conference of Parties, the COP meeting, and this year was no exception when we launched the report in December in Poland, Katowice. The press release was launch was chaired by our CEO, Brad Page, as well as our international advisor, Lord Nick Stern. And this happened, we had the biggest gathering that we have ever had, perhaps underlining the increased attention and interest CCS receiving as a clean technology. Similarly, in the first month after we launched our report, we had more downloads of it than the previous 2017 report received in an entire year. One of the aspects of the report that we're most proud of is the fact that this year we featured perspectives from 18 ambassadors, advocates for CCS from various different paths of life. And one of them that you see on the slide is a 17-year-old Australian polar explorer, a lady by the name of Jade Hemister, who has single-handedly skied to both she's the youngest person to have skied to both the North Pole and the South Pole and to experience the damage that climate change can cause on the Earth. And she says, we must pursue carbon capture and storage as our lives depend on it, because they do, which we think is it's an immensely powerful message to give for the support of carbon capture and storage. And here on this slide, what looks like a starry night is actually a global map of CCS facilities in existence today. And what you will notice is that US has quite a density of those dots of these CCS projects, and indeed 10 of the 18 commercial-sized facilities in existence in today are based in the US. However, China had its first commercial facility become operational this year, in actual 2018, and it has a number of projects both under construction and in development. I think the number is reaching almost 30 at the moment. Australia has its first CCS project in Gorgon come online in 2019, and Norway and Japan are pushing ahead. So what does this mean for US technology leadership in CCS going forward? That will be the topic of our conversation this afternoon. And with that, I would like to turn over to our General Manager of Client Engagement, Jeff Erickson. Jeff.
Thank you, Galore, and thank you to David and the Atlantic Council for hosting the event today with the Global CCS Institute. It's fitting that this conversation takes place here at the Atlantic Council. The Council declares that they seek to shape policy choices and strategies to create a more secure and prosperous world. Climate change is the greatest threat to a more secure and prosperous world over the long term, and carbon capture and storage is an essential part of the portfolio of actions and technologies that are required to address it. Just a further word about the Global CCS Institute before I begin. As Galore said, our mission is to accelerate deployment of carbon capture and storage globally. We have three overarching goals for our work. We want to build knowledge, shift the narrative, and enable investment. We're led by our members. Currently, we have about 50 members spread across the globe, and we welcome you to talk with myself or any of my colleagues here with the Institute after the meeting today at the reception if you want more information. I'm going to spend about 15 minutes kind of setting the table for the discussion among our speakers that will follow. I'll provide some of the key takeaways from our 2018 Global Status of CCS report, which, as Galore said, was released in Katowice at COP24 in December. And then I'll hand off to Assistant Secretary Winberg for his views before our panel from around the world will describe how the technology is advancing in their countries. The provocation that we have offered as the title of today's discussion is U.S. Technology Leadership at Risk, is an acknowledgement that advances in carbon capture are happening all around the world. It's both a competitive and a collaborative landscape, and one that will, in a very real sense, affect the lives of hundreds of millions of people. Before diving into the report itself, let me provide some thoughts on the broader context in which this report was released. In October, the IPCC 1.5C degrees report was released, more formally known as the Special Report on Global Warming of 1.5 degrees C. Its conclusions are quite confronting. Beyond all the numbers and degrees of confidence and pathways and science speak are some very disturbing messages. The first is that even if we can limit global warming to 1.5 C, natural and human systems will be affected significantly, with many more negative than positive consequences. Said another way, populations that are already vulnerable to sea level rise, food shortages, severe weather, and many other maladies will be even more vulnerable in a warmer world. And the warmer it becomes, the more vulnerable they become. As one example, 10 million more people will be exposed to risks of sea level rise in a 2-degree world than in a 1.5 degree world. The second message from that Ipcc report is that it's going to be very difficult to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 C. The report states that we have about 10 years at our current level of carbon emissions before our 1.5 degree carbon budget runs out. So we are running out of time. And the third message is that to have any chance of staying below 1.5 degrees, we need to see a massive scale up of low carbon technologies, carbon capture and storage among them. We are most certainly running out of time. There's an urgency in what needs to be done. It's easy for us as we tout the progress and achievements we have made, and you'll hear more about that over the next hour. It's easy for us to put that out of our minds, but we'd be best not to forget it. And with that sober reminder, let's dive into the report. The theme for this year's report could very well be stars. It begins with an introduction from our CEO, Brad Page, who states, "I think that it's likely that when we look back in a few years, 2018 may well go down as the year when the stars began to align again for CCS." And the report finishes with Julio Friedman's perspective, which includes his pronouncement that the stars have begun to align for carbon management, including CCS, carbon to value, and carbon removal. And the report, as Galore noted, is populated with supporting comments from a broad constituency of professional and political stars, including economist Lord Nicholas Stern, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, Fatih Birol, the father of the phrase global warming, Wally Brucker, former U.S. Senator and Secretary of the Navy John Warner, Emmy Award winner Paul Atkins, and, as Galore mentions, 17-year-old Australian polar explorer Jade Hamister. And the report highlights, maybe not stars, but certainly shining examples of policies and projects around the world that are accelerating the deployment of carbon capture, reducing the risk of climate change, enhancing energy security, and providing jobs and economic growth. So let's take a look at some of those examples, starting with projects. In 2018, one more large-scale CCS facility was added to the Institute's operational status in our database. That was the Jiulin facility in China, bringing the total number of operating facilities to 18. These 18 facilities capture and permanently store more than 40 million tons of CO2 annually. That's like taking 8.5 million cars off the road each year. 5 large-scale projects are under construction, 2 in Canada, associated with the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line, 2 in China, both capturing industrial emissions, and the Gorgon project on an LNG terminal on the west coast of Australia. These 5 projects, once operational, will prevent another 7 million metric tons of CO2 from entering the atmosphere each year. There are an additional 20 large-scale facilities in planning and many more in pilot stage or capturing CO2 in smaller volumes. Geographically, more than half of the 23 facilities in operation or construction are in North America. There's 10 in the US and 4 in Canada. 18 of the 23 use enhanced oil recovery as a means of permanent storage and to generate income to pay for the project. The 5 others that store CO2 using dedicated geologic storage are located in Norway, Canada, the US, and Australia. Nearly all, 21 of the 23 projects that capture CO2 are applied to industrial emissions, several on natural gas processing units, but also on chemical plants, fertilizer production and hydrogen production plants, an ethanol plant, and a steel plant. Carbon capture on cement and waste incineration are in early planning. So only 2 of the 23 carbon capture facilities are attached to power plants. Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan was the world's first power plant with CCS, and in 2018 surpassed 4 years of operation and 2.4 million tons of CO2 captured and permanently stored. And Petronova, outside of Houston, has now been operating for 2 years, and in 2018 surpassed 2 million metric tons of CO2 captured and permanently stored. But that's not the entire picture in power plants. There's another power plant that's generated a lot of excitement, the Net Power plant, located near the Houston Shipping Channel in Texas. The 50 megawatt demonstration gas-fired power plant began operations in the first half of 2018, and it intends to demonstrate the viability of the alum cycle, which includes complete CO2 capture, inherent in the electricity generation process, requiring no separate carbon capture unit and eliminating the energy penalty, and at a cost equal to or less than coal-fired power without carbon capture. So that's a snapshot of at least some of the carbon capture facility developments in 2018. More encouraging, I would say, than the facility deployment numbers is the movement on the policy front. And this is why we believe that carbon capture stars are beginning to align. Of course, the big story in CCS policy in 2018 happened right here in DC, what we all refer to as 45Q. As part of the Bipartisan Budget Act passed by Congress last February, Section 45Q of the IRS tax code was revised to substantially increase the tax credits for capturing and storing CO2. We now have in the U.S. one of the largest incentives in the world, $35 per metric ton for CO2 storage associated with enhanced oil recovery, and $50 per metric ton for dedicated geologic storage. The passage of this law generated interest around the world. After passage of the credits, we were asked by many of our corporate and government members for details on the legislation. They all wanted to have a look at it and see how elements might apply in their own political and policy regimes. Across the country, in California, the Air Resources Board finalized a protocol for CCS within the low carbon fuel standard, enabling fuel that utilizes CCS in its production to participate in the low carbon fuels market. The market price for carbon reductions under that program is currently in the $180 per ton range, providing a solid business case for additional carbon capture facilities that provide liquid fuels to California consumers. And in the medium term, the establishment of a CCS protocol also paves the way for CCS to become eligible in the state's cap and trade program. Very quickly, and you'll be hearing more about other countries in a moment from the panel, but to give you a bit of a teaser, let me start in Norway. The Norwegian government in 2018 continued its support for a full-chain CCS project. In 2018, the government approved funding for a front-end engineering and design, or FEED study, that included capturing CO2 from a cement plant and a municipal waste energy plant and permanently storing it offshore. This is the latest action in a long history of support in Norway for CES, which has resulted in 2 offshore geologic storage sites, the establishment of a CCS research agency called Gassnova, and the Technology Testing Center, TCM. In the UK government in 2018 provided a strong signal of commitment to carbon capture and storage. Its clean growth strategy, released in October of 2017, reflects the government's ambition to deploy CCUS at scale during the 2030s. The government committed £100 million to carbon capture innovation to lower costs. In 2018, the CCUS Cost Challenge Task Force completed its report, Delivering Clean Growth, which acknowledged the CCUS is pivotal to decarbonizing major industry and identified the need for stable, long-term supportive policies. So these are just 2 examples in Norway and the UK of reinvigoration of interest in carbon capture in a part of the world in Europe which has long been opposed to it. China's support for carbon capture has strengthened over the past year as it moves from aspiration to action. Measures they have enacted include creating a national carbon market in the electricity sector, widely promoting low-carbon technologies with an emphasis on carbon capture and utilization, supporting carbon capture pilot projects, and amending their environmental impact assessment guidelines to better address carbon capture projects. But here's the big China story. By our count, there are currently 30 carbon capture projects that are in some stage of development in China. The pipeline for new projects in recent years shifted substantially away from the US and primarily into China. If the US is to retain its leadership, both public and private sector support will be required, necessary to invest more heavily in carbon capture projects. And finally, Japan continues to implement a comprehensive and strategic program to accelerate the deployment of carbon capture. The government supports a wide range of carbon capture activities, including investigation of potential CO2 storage sites, feasibility studies, and the development of legal and regulatory structures necessary to manage carbon storage over the long term. And they have announced that the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo will be hydrogen fueled, including substantial investments in hydrogen fuel cell cars and buses, and an Olympic village fueled exclusively by hydrogen fuel cell power. So that takes me to the topic of hydrogen. If there's one word that has permeated energy and climate change conversations in this past year, it's been hydrogen, and right alongside that, CCS. 2018 saw interest in hydrogen-related carbon capture take off. Part of that is the versatility of this energy carrier. It can be used to generate electricity, can be used for household heating, as a transportation fuel, and as an industrial feedstock. Last year, 6 new large-scale capture projects were added to our facilities database, and all are related to hydrogen production. 2 of those are in England, 2 are in Ireland, and 2 are in the Netherlands. In early 2018, the governments of Japan, Australia, and the Australian state of Victoria, along with several industry partners, announced the launch of the hydrogen energy supply chain. This initiative is the first step towards providing CCS-enabled, low-emission hydrogen from the Latrobe Valley's abundant brown coal reserves. Hydrogen will be exported to Japan for use in heating and transportation. The project heralds the birth of a hydrogen industry in Australia that will ultimately put CCS at the center of a new energy economy, securing jobs, sustaining communities, and paving the way for a global hydrogen economy that combats climate change. We expect interest in carbon-free hydrogen produced from fossil fuels, the application of carbon capture, to continue to grow rapidly in 2019 and beyond. In addition to hydrogen, 2 other angles on carbon capture generated both headlines and investment. The first is carbon utilization, sequestering CO2 by using it in the creation of useful products, from fertilizer feedstock to soda ash to foams used in mattresses and upholstered furniture to plastic to bricks and cement. The Carbon X Prize, a $20 million competition to develop technologies that will convert CO2 emissions into valuable products, in 2018 announced its 5 finalists, and the birth of 2 functioning test beds in Alberta and Wyoming. The second angle that got a lot of attention last year is direct air capture. More and more scientists, business leaders, and policymakers are expecting an overshoot of agreed climate goals, whether that's 1.5 or 2 degrees, and the need to pull CO2 directly out of the atmosphere. Companies that are progressing direct air capture technologies got a lot of press in 2018, as well as additional funding. One notable example is Occidental and Chevron's equity investment in carbon engineering, announced just after the new year. So these applications of carbon capture, while they're currently small in volume compared to geologic storage, are helping to build a broader and deeper coalition of carbon capture proponents. However, they should be seen as complementing rather than replacing geologic storage, which remains and is likely to remain for some time where the big volume opportunity is. And volume, as the Ipcc report makes clear, is what's currently needed and urgently needed in the near and midterm. So to sum up, 2018 was an impactful year for carbon capture and storage. There are signs of momentum for these low-carbon technologies wherever you look. As Brad Page says in the introduction to the status report, CCS has proven itself as real, happening, and here to stay. That said, the road ahead is still pretty challenging. Policies to incentivize low-carbon technologies, investor confidence, public support, and private sector initiative remain in short supply. If we are to achieve a stable climate, carbon capture and storage must be deployed at scale. As Jade Hamister, the teen polar explorer, said in her contribution to the status report, "I'm confident that my generation will have the technology, the passion, and the unified movement to make a meaningful difference. But it's up to current world leaders to make sure we still have a fighting chance." Thank you for your attention. I'd like to now introduce our next speaker. Steve Winberg is the Assistant Secretary of Energy for Fossil Energy. He's been in this position for just over a year now. In fact, the first public speech that I think he gave after he came into this position was this event that we had in December of last year, and we were really pleased to have him attend then, and we're very pleased to have him attend as well. Mr. Assistant Secretary, the podium is yours.
Good afternoon. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. We have almost a full house, and that's always encouraging. I want to start off by thanking the Atlantic Council and the Global CCS Institute for facilitating this discussion on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. I also want to thank Jeff for the overview of GCCSI's report on the global status of CCUS. That report is encouraging, and it is also sobering. We're making a lot of progress towards CCUS deployment and commercialization, but we still have a lot of work to do, so I agree with you there. And I think that today's panel gives us an opportunity to discuss not only where we are and the opportunities that we have, but where we're going, both in the U.S. and globally. But I want to thank the GCCSI for all they've done and for what you continue to do to advance CCUS. It's important work, it's valuable, so thank you very much. And finally, thanks go to our panelists, who you will hear from in a moment, and our moderator, David Livingston. Especially want to recognize one of Fossil Energy's own, Lynn Brickett. Lynn's from the National Energy Technology Lab, and she'll tell you in more detail about some of the work that the Department of Energy is doing to advance CCUS technology. So as we kick off today's discussion, I think it's important to underscore the fact that advancing CCUS is a two-pronged effort that requires certainly continued technology development, but also requires smart policies that promote the commercialization of CCUS. Both are required. Otherwise, I think without both of those, folks, we're simply spinning our wheels. So I want to frame my remarks today around what Secretary Perry has called the new energy realism. The idea that by embracing innovation and policies that encourage innovation rather than heavy-handed regulation, we can promote energy security, economic growth, and environmental responsibility. That's at the heart of what we're doing at DOE. And that's what drives our work to develop innovative clean energy technologies, technologies that include fossil energy innovations like transformational clean coal technologies and CCUS. And with global fossil energy consumption, including coal consumption, projected to remain steady for the foreseeable future, it is technology innovation that can solve some of our most difficult global challenges. Challenges that include ending energy poverty, providing low-cost energy, and reducing global emissions. And CCUS is one of those innovations. And here in the U.S., it is a key component of the President's energy strategy to expand the development of our fossil energy resources and improve and strengthen our fossil energy systems. This strategy also includes work to help modernize the nation's electricity grid by boosting the efficiency of the existing coal fleet and to lay the groundwork for more modular coal plants of the future through our Coal First initiative. Plants that are more efficient, that will help strengthen our grid, and that are better candidates for CCUS technologies. The U.S. has been and remains in the forefront of CCUS development, and the Department of Energy funding and the Department of Energy has been funding and supporting much of this R&D. Over the first 2 years of the Trump administration, we've appropriated around $400 million for CCUS R&D, including approximately $200 million for carbon capture R&D that is focused on both pre-combustion capture and post-combustion capture technologies. So let me just take a couple of minutes and discuss what the U.S. and in particular the department is doing to advance CCUS. Let's take a look at the lay of the land. Right now, the GCCSI database lists more than 40 CCUS projects of various sizes and scope, and Eric talked about some of those today. More than half of those are funded by the Department of Energy, and that includes 3 large-scale facilities operating today: ADM project in Illinois, the Air Products project in Texas, and the world's largest post-combustion carbon capture project, the Petronova project, also in Texas. So U.S. technology development and demonstration is moving the ball down the field. Still, there are some technical hurdles to CCUS commercialization, the most significant being the cost of carbon capture, which we need to reduce by about 50%, ultimately getting it down to around $30 a ton. So at DOE, one of our main focuses is on R&D that can help drive down the cost of the capture technologies. To date, we've validated performance of 10 post-combustion carbon capture technologies at the small pilot scale size. And last year we selected 6 projects, a total of nearly $18 million to develop transformational and low-cost carbon capture processes and technologies. We also awarded $44 million to 7 projects to test advanced technologies at large scale and to conduct feasibility studies for commercial scale capture systems. And we announced another $30 million in funding for technologies to help significantly reduce the cost of carbon capture from coal-fired power plants. We also issued a funding opportunity announcement. We will be issuing a funding opportunity announcement in the next few months to support at least 2 front-end engineering design studies for commercial scale carbon capture systems that can be applied to coal and natural gas plants. In the meantime, using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery or converting CO2 to value-added commercial products could provide a strong business case for retrofitting existing power plants with carbon capture. So the Department of Energy is investing in technologies to convert CO2 into commodities and valuable products that could stimulate the deployment of carbon capture technologies in fossil energy systems and industrial processes. To date, we have awarded nearly $15 million to 15 projects to convert CO2 to valuable products. These projects are looking at novel ways to utilize CO2, such as integrating biological systems such as algae into power plants to make fuels, chemical, and food supplements or animal feed. Another is investigating opportunities to accelerate the uptake of CO2 into cements and other building products. And finally, using novel catalyst and other conversion technologies to open up a number of possibilities to use CO2 to make plastics, carbon fiber, high-value chemicals, and other commercial products. At the same time, we have a robust carbon storage program that to date has injected over 10 million metric tons of CO2. For example, we've completed 25 injection projects for enhanced oil recovery and coal bed methane recovery and in saline formations for storage. And going forward, our carbon-safe storage initiative will characterize and evaluate the feasibility of storage complexes with capacities of at least 50 million metric tons of CO2. We've also developed state-of-the-art monitoring technologies to track and account for CO2 in the subsurface, as well as project assessment and database management systems to determine best practices. We're also ramping up our big data and machine learning efforts across our research and development portfolio, including CCUS R&D. For example, the Carbon Capture Simulation Initiative is using big data and machine learning to accelerate the commercialization of carbon capture technologies and ultimately the widespread deployment of advanced power generation. We're also building on past subsurface work to improve site selection for geological storage of CO2, improve CO2 storage and utilization efficiency for enhanced oil recovery, and increase the certainty of secure containment and environmental protection. Along these lines, we're aiming to issue funding opportunity announcements in the coming months for projects to develop transformational sensing capabilities, technologies that can reduce uncertainty and enable real-time decision-making associated with subsurface CO2 storage. So U.S. leadership in CCUS technology development remains strong, and that leadership remains critical to global deployment of CCUS. But there are challenges to CCUS that go beyond the technology. The fact remains that the lack of strong policies to support CCUS commercialization, and particularly policies that encourage investment in CCUS, means that CCUS technologies continue to lag behind other clean energy technologies. And it's important to the need for the public and private sectors to do more to advance CCUS technologies from the laboratory to the marketplace. That means that in addition to technology development, we need more robust policies for CCUS that can provide financing and market certainty needed to deploy, and that will support the development of CCUS supply chains, commercial infrastructure, and private investment. This isn't just a U.S. issue, it's a global issue, and each nation will have to meet their particular challenges to CCUS. In the U.S., we're looking at policies that could encourage the use of CCUS technology, and the government is working with industry to address these challenges and barriers. Of course, one promising avenue is the use of tax credits, and again, Eric talked about the 45Q. What the 45Q does, in short, is it increases the payment from $20 a ton to $50 a ton for saline storage, and from $10 a ton to $35 a ton for EOR, and also enhanced gas recovery and other utilization methods as well. So it's not limited just to EOR. This level of government support seems to have energized U.S. industry to find business models that can work to stand up projects. However, the clock is ticking. Projects need to start construction by the end of 2023 in order to take advantage of the tax credits. And the IRS still has some work to do. And to that end, Secretary Perry has sent a letter to Treasury suggesting that the Department of Energy would be happy to assist. Now that the shutdown is over, I'm quite hopeful that the IRS will get to work in developing these much-needed rules and regulations so that we can fully avail ourselves of the 45Q tax credit. So, the need for the technology development and for policies and regulation is so important. And this is why in governments, industry, banks, including development banks, and other investors with climate portfolios all need to find ways to advance these technologies globally. All of this will require continued international collaboration and cooperation on the technology side and on the policy side. So the United States is actively looking to build on our history of leadership and collaboration with international partners, both bilaterally and multilaterally, through initiatives that include the Carbon Sequestration Leadership Forum, Mission Innovation, the IEA, and the Clean Energy Ministerial. And we are very excited about the upcoming Clean Energy Ministerial, which has now included a CCUS initiative. It was officially launched at the last CEM meeting in Copenhagen last June, with 10 countries on board and with growing interest. So at the end of the day, technology development and smart policies are critical for what we need to do. I can tell you that the United States government will remain a strong global voice for CCUS, and I expect that we will be more involved than ever to develop and broadly deploy these critical technologies. So, in closing, to the point of, or the title of this meeting today, the global status of CCUS is U.S. technology leadership at risk, let me just offer you a couple of thoughts. The first is that if you want to look at this as a horse race, and other countries are speeding up their horse and getting into the race, that's great. We encourage it. We think it's absolutely a must that other countries participate in this to the same extent that the United States has. Quantity is impressive, but quality is what is important. And my final thought for you is that in the last year, what I've seen occurring is a convergence between the coal industry and the oil and gas industry. We now have the OGCI, the Oil and Gas Carbon Initiative, boasting over $1 billion from its members. And that combined, and that's a global institute or global effort. So that combined with what countries are doing and what private industry will do with the right tax incentives and the right policies, I think we don't have to look at it as a horse race. And I don't think we should look at it as a horse race. But rather, I think we ought to look at it as all the horses pulling together to move this very heavily loaded wagon down the road in time frames that will make a difference. So thank you very much for your attention.
Great, go ahead. Wonderful. Thank you, Assistant Secretary. Thank you, Jeff, for your remarks and that overview of the Global CCS Status Report. And I'm now pleased to kick off an expert panel, a global panel, and a panel, I couldn't think of a better one to guide us through a tour d'horizon, a tour de monde of the different projects that are going on in the world today, and what all this means for, indeed, U.S. technology leadership and U.S. climate policy going forward. It's a new year, it's 2019. We at the Atlantic Council are constantly innovating, so as you'll note, I'm not going to be up on stage today. I'm going to be roaming around the room moderating this session from the floor. That means that you can't sleep, you can't nod off, and you have to be engaged in today's conversation. We're also not going to hold Q&A until the very end of today's event. Instead, we're going to pepper it through the entirety of today's panel. So I'll start going to the audience as soon as 10 or 20 minutes from now. So if you have questions, start thinking about them. And I'll turn around in just a little bit to start throwing some questions your way so that the audience can participate from the very get-go as well. First, though, I want to kick things off by introducing our panel, and then I'll throw each of them a question just to launch into things and to start things off. First up is Lynn Brickett. She's the technology manager at NEDL, the National Energy Technology Laboratory, where she works indeed on translating many of the different policy developments that we heard about from Assistant Secretary Winberg and translating those into technological advancement on the ground in our national labs and in our innovation ecosystem here in the United States. Next to her is Daiichi Nakahara, Vice President and Director of Operations at IHI Inc., a Japanese technology company with working with a number of different partners, including MIT, on a variety of different carbon capture technologies. Next to him is Geir Westgard, Vice President for Political and Public Affairs of Equinor, formerly known as Statoil, with a variety of different projects, both in the power sector and the industrial sector that employ carbon capture. And next to him, Kurt Waltzer, Managing Director at Clean Air Task Force, an organization which has done more than any I can think of to help situate the role that carbon capture can play in, as we discussed in the beginning of this event, our climate policy toolkit. Lynn, let me go to you first. As I noted, your job is to translate all of these policy developments into actual technological advancement on the ground. Can you give us a sense, dive a little bit deeper into the variety of projects here in the U.S. that Assistant Secretary Winberg noted? What is the current state of U.S. technology leadership? and how to date have the policy advancements of the past led us to where we are today with the technology.
Okay, thank you. Well, as we heard from both Jeff and the Assistant Secretary, 45Q has, in my career in CCS, which has been longer than I'd like to admit, we are seeing such movement based on the 45Q and the changes that happened last February. So the interest and the potential is happening. Now, of course, the downside of that is the time really is now. As we heard about the sunset provision, and certainly we know that the other tax incentives, wind and solar, were extended, but we don't know that that's going to be the case for this. So the time is now. To that end, I'm very excited. Again, the Assistant Secretary mentioned it briefly, but this year, in fiscal year 19, we are going out with $30 million for a FEED study for commercial scale design of up to 2 or 3 full-scale carbon capture systems. So on the lines of the Petronova project. The excitement on this is, if the timing is right, these will inform the next scale build that can then take advantage of the 45Q. It can meet the sunset provision based on the schedule that we've laid out. So we know that this requires public-private partnerships. We know that's what is the successful model, and this will be one more along that same pathway. I also wanted to mention, similar to what we heard the Assistant Secretary say, DOE's program is strong, and I also think we are leading. The U.S. is leading. However, we understand, everybody understands that CO2 is a global problem. It's global climate change. It requires global solutions. It's very expensive. R&D is very expensive. We heard recently, just last week, that Duke Energy has gotten rid of some of their R&D arms of their program. We need support with other countries. The U.S. needs to work with other countries. To that end, we've been working with Norway at Technology Center Mongstad. It's a wonderful test facility. The U.S. has already tested one technology, U.S.-developed technology, at the facility. We currently have one there now, and we have 4 others that are lined up to go there. The idea is we don't all need to replicate test centers. It's much too expensive, and we need the answers now. We don't have the time for every country to build their own test center. We must work together. Similar to that, there's 2 other activities that we've been involved with internationally. ACTS, which is Accelerating CCS Technologies. That was several European countries have been putting multi-country proposals together. Last year, the U.S. for the first time joined ACT. So we're working with the best and brightest from every country to really come up with the valuable CCUS ideas and solutions. Lastly, the International Test Center Network is also something that we, the U.S., participate in through our National Carbon Capture Center, which is our test facility. Norway participates through their Technology Center Mongstad, and many other countries are involved in that. The idea behind that is, let's develop the right protocols, the right tools. Let's not have every country reinvent the wheel when it comes to measurement, when it comes to testing, when it comes to analytical methods. We're doing it together. We have meetings, several meetings a year to develop these technologies. So I think, back to what we said, the title of this meeting, I think U.S. leadership is certainly strong, but I think we have to remember it's a global problem. We're running out of time, and we need to use global solutions, which means partnerships with other countries.
So how are we utilizing our asset base together and not reinventing the wheel?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Daiichi, that leads really well into you. Could you give us a sense of what the development, innovation, and deployment landscape for CCS looks like in Japan, and what role IHI is playing in that?
Okay. So the Japanese government established the new energy policy the last July, and it's called Fifth Strategic Energy Plan, and which is the kind of new energy policy looking at the year after 2030, and this contains the development of the CO2 reduction technologies such as the IGCC or of course CCUS, and the other thing is the promotion of the Japanese high efficiency technology for the power plant, and so that based on this plan, the Japanese government, especially the METI, which is the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, is is taking lead for this, and they are initiating some demonstration of the CCS in Japan. They are already doing some project which is inject the CO2 into the ground under the sea, like, and also they are trying to locate the actual site which can be the future CO2 capture injection place, and so and already they selected the candidate place, and then now they are starting drilling. So this is what happened in Japan now.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Geir, let me turn to you and get your perspective. Equinor is a Norwegian company, of course, but Equinor is active globally. You've got, like I mentioned, CCS projects that are oriented around the power sector, CCS projects oriented around the industrial sector. Could you tell us a little bit more about your portfolio and what you look for as well in the policy environment that leads you to commit to developing projects in a given geography?
Okay, so
I'm sorry, actually, let's go quickly to Geir, and then we'll come back to you, Daiichi, for a little bit more on that.
I think we heard it at the outset here, that there is a need, this is an area where you need public-private partnership. And there is a role for government to play in setting the policy framework within which we operate. And then it is up to us in business to develop the kind of business models that actually can make this commercial. And it doesn't work without that interaction as of today. So let me just say a little bit about the kind of framework I think needs to be in place for this public-private partnership model to work. And then I can say a little bit about how we, on the basis of that, have developed some of our own projects, basically around the North Sea, primarily in Europe. First and foremost, I think there is clearly a role for policymakers here. There is no doubt about that. And I think in many ways we have to look at some of the lessons that we have learned over the last few years. Just as regulatory support helped ensure steady demand for renewable energy in certain countries, I think the right policy environment also in this case will encourage companies and investors to get behind CCUS. Now we are talking about arrangements for risk sharing between companies and governments. And the risk sharing can take many different forms. We've heard about this also from Assistant Secretary Winberg. But I think it starts with dealing with perhaps the largest disincentive to the development of CCUS today. And that is the fact that there is, in many places, a lack of a meaningful cost for actually emitting CO2. So some kind of CO2 pricing is a starting point. And added to that, You have complementary measures, you have more targeted measures. They can be, as we've heard, tax credits, they can be grant funding, R&D funding, feed-in tariffs, etc., etc. All of these mechanisms can help promote and support CCUS. Now, a carbon tax on the Norwegian continental shelf in the early 1990s was around $45 per ton, which is about what we're talking about in some of the proposals and in 45Q as well, roughly around that. That was the price that allowed us to transport and store CO2 on the Norwegian continental shelf in a commercially viable way. We were able to utilize the fact that we had a commercial challenge, sour gas. We needed to bring the CO2 content of the gas down, and we were able to do it in a commercially viable way because of CO2 tax on the Norwegian continental shelf. So that's one example of how you can build a business model for that kind of solution to a commercial challenge at the outset. Now, that was pre-combustion CCS. What we are looking at going forward is, of course, post-combustion CCS, both in the industrial and in the power sector. We have focused on projects around the North Sea. The Northern Lights project was mentioned. There is a clean gas project currently put together by OGCI member companies.
Oil and Gas Climate Initiative.
Oil and Gas Climate Initiative companies. And the reason why we are involved in these projects is that we see a commercial opportunity for ourselves to leverage the storage, CO2 storage experience that we have from the Norwegian continental shelf, from the North Sea, and to try to develop business models and value chains for CO2 that will allow us to become a transporter, if you will, of CO2 from third parties and store that on the Norwegian continental shelf. The Northern Lights project is about that, and the project in the UK put together by the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative is also about that. The other business model that we are looking at here is, of course, as has already been mentioned, hydrogen, and how to strip CO2 from hydrogen through CCUS. And we think that it is these types of innovative uses of CCS, if you will, that will ensure that natural gas is not just, as some claim, a bridge fuel to a low carbon future, but it is actually a part of the destination for that low carbon future. And we think that's an important part of this discussion as well.
Very interesting, and thank you. Kurt, let me turn to you, because you're from Clean Air Task Force. I want you to kind of tell us, for an audience, let's say a skeptical, environmentally oriented observer who said, you know, the narrative that I have in my head is that for the past, few decades, carbon capture and storage has overpromised and underdelivered. Is that true? Are we at a fundamentally new inflection point in the competitiveness of the technology? And how do you view this from an organization like Clean Air Task Force that's thinking about this in a climate policy perspective?
Well, first I would say that our view of CCS is a crucial tool in the toolkit for decarbonizing our planet. It's very difficult to imagine, given how, just focusing on China, going back to China just for a moment, we have nearly 1,000 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants, most of which are new, And if we don't have a viable, affordable, scalable option to address the CO2 emissions from those sources, it's hard to imagine how we're going to potentially meet any carbon budget, whether it's 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. And the Ipcc reports, I think, are very clear in that if we want an affordable path, or the most affordable pathway, and the pathway that's most likely to succeed, we better have a CCS option in the mix. In terms of where the technology stands, I'm sort of pessimistic and optimistic. I agree that for 30 years we've been kind of messing around. I mean, the technology's been around for many decades. We've been capturing carbon since the 30s for industrial purposes. We've injected almost 1 billion tons of CO2 into oil fields and know very well how to manage that. And in the US, we have 4,000 miles of CO2 pipelines. So we have all the components, but we haven't really threaded them together until very recently. I'm optimistic because, as noted before, Congress recently adopted what I think is a fairly strong incentive around the $35 to $50 per ton cost range or incentive range for CCS. And I think while time is short, I agree, probably too short, we need to, that provides a really unparalleled opportunity. So I think it's, and I think as was noted before, time is short if we're going to implement these at large scale in a time frame that's meaningful for the climate. So while it's a great start, we need to do much more both in the US and internationally to get the, as Assistant Secretary Winberg said, get all the horses pulling together this heavy load.
Excellent, thank you. Daiichi, let me come back to you real quick. I'd love to hear a little bit more about the oxy-fuel combustion project that, that IHI has worked on, as well as if you have any thoughts that connect to what Geir was talking about in terms of a business model or a comprehensive model for developing CCS that involves the hydrogen economy, since Japan is such a leader in painting a vision in which the hydrogen economy plays a very significant part of our energy future.
Actually, the oxy-fuel technology is for the mainly for the mainly available for the coal-fired power plant. And actually, that's we are not applying for the hydrogen technologies. But anyway, yeah, I would like to introduce about the oxy-fuel technology, and this is the technology that which inject the oxygen instead of usual air into the boiler of the coal-fired power plant, and then from the boiler, so the exhaust gas is only the pure CO2, and so which can capture easily. So this is our technology, and so we are and so actually the Japanese government. And so the Australian government, and then so the Japanese company and the Australian company form the kind of partnership, and then we did some the demonstration project there, and so and the reason why we are looking at this oxy-fuel technology because of the we are also developing other technologies, but it's we can get the cheaper carbon capture rate because so that we can sell the some the nitrogen which are when we are purifying the O2 the air, we can get the nitrogen and we can sell that also. Yeah, and so in that kind. I'm sorry. For that reason, so that we are more focusing on the oxy-fuel technology for the development. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. That's your oxy-fuel project then, right? And how old is that project?
This project is that started from the 2008, and then so that we finished the 2015. We applied for the 30 megawatts, the 4 units of the coal-fired power plant in Australia, and then also that this is the only and first project in the world of oxy-fuel, the commercial operation plant, and so we also did the CO2 injection into the ground.
Excellent. As promised, I want to turn to the audience. I want to get some audience questions in here early. So please put up your hand if you already have something that you would like to ask. We'll have some roaming microphones that are going to get activated. And if you're as lucky as Gear and some of them up there, you'll get 2 or 3 different microphones during the time of your question. Let's start with this gentleman right here. And then we'll pass to this gentleman. We'll take 2 questions at a time. So we'll start with you, and then we'll bring in a second question down here.
Thank you. Charles Franklin, Portland Cement Association. And is it David? I'm not sure. I heard earlier there was a conversation about the Norway project involving a cement plant that I think is going on. Could you any of you speak a little bit more about that, both in terms of a little bit more about the timing and how you see that playing out in terms of price?
Terrific. And then one question right here. Let's take them together, and then we'll go to the panel.
Yes, Bob Wright from the Wright Group. It's for the gentleman from Equinor. One of the controversies in the United States is not only if we have a tax, how do we spend the large sums of money that are raised from it? Could you tell me what Norway does with the tax money that they raise?
Terrific. So it looks like Gear is a popular person for this first set of questions. We've got 2 questions dealing with Norway or with an Equinor cement-focused project. Gear?
Sure. So, first, Mike. So there are 3 companies involved in the Northern Lights project. It's ourselves, it's Shell, and Total. And we are in a public-private partnership with the Norwegian government to develop what would be the first full-scale CCS project in Norway. The project will source third-party CO2 from 2 sources at the outset. One is a cement plant outside of Oslo in Norway, and the other is from a waste-to-energy plant. Our role as energy companies is basically to develop a model for how we can transport the CO2 from the 2 plants, store that temporarily near the place where the CO2 will ultimately be transported offshore and stored in geological structures in the North Sea of Norway. So that's basically the model, if you will. The first phase of this project could reach up to 1.5 million tons of CO2 stored per year. We have been awarded the study contract for the CO2 receiving terminal and ultimately for the transport and storage. And final investment decision, as we currently look at this, is expected sometime in 2020. We also hope that this will be a project that allows us to move away from building standalone CCUS facilities with dedicated transport and storage infrastructure into a model whereby you have multi-user hub and cluster facilities. And if you are able to build that kind of CCS infrastructure, we believe that it becomes easier for others to tie into that infrastructure and ultimately much easier to drive the costs down. This is what we are aiming for in the project in Norway, and it is ultimately also what we are aiming for in the project in the UK, which is in the power sector, and it's called the Clean Gas Project, where we are together with our partners in the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative.
Terrific. Thank you. Lynn, I just want to ask you as well, because I think this is relevant for the US context. Are you seeing more of a move towards this, a new model in which you're thinking through hubs, or in the technology development that you're doing, you're seeing the private sector interest is really oriented around having multi-user facilities in which different companies and different technologies can plug in and create essentially a supply chain in which the, let's say, the excess waste heat of one is a valuable input for another, or something along those lines?
We are, and it's my counterpart, Tracy Radosta, is not here, although I do have headquarters help here as well. Mark Akovich and John Latinsky are in the audience, but we are pursuing something under the storage program, not the capture program that I'm in charge of, but carbon safe. And the idea is to permit a very large storage complex. Now, we're a little bit different than the Norwegians, as they do offshore, and we're onshore. So we in the United States currently, and that's not to say we're not exploring offshore, but the majority of the work that DOE has done so far has been onshore. And with that comes a lot of NIMBY, not in my backyard, and permitting issues. So when you talk about a very large complex, it is complex. But we are pursuing that with the same thought in mind. And then what comes along with that, what the carbon capture side of the program is offering to that, is multi-point sources that would use that one storage complex. And again, both industrial, we heard the man talk about cement, industrial as well as power.
Excellent. Yeah, absolutely.
Great, thanks, Bernetta.
Your mic may be working, so give it a test first.
We'll cover it somehow. So, following up on the points about hydrogen and sort of multi-use, I think one of the interesting growing aspects in Japan, I think, is a real leader on this, is looking at hydrogen and the liquid version of hydrogen, ammonia, as fuels, which today the least cost supply of that now would be probably steam methane reforming of gas with carbon capture and storage. And that has the potential, I think it's very interesting potential, to get at those hard to reach emissions sources like heavy duty engines, shipping, potentially the other about half the transportation emissions that we don't really have a good solution for right now. Also, and I specifically wanted to ask you about this, Gear, it may have a way to be an alternative way to look at CCS on power plants. Instead of having CCS at the back of an end of a power plant, you have hydrogen or ammonia as a fuel that's delivered to a existing gas turbine. And I'm particularly thinking of the Magnum project in the Netherlands, where they're seemingly studying repurposing those for hydrogen with carbon-free hydrogen coming from the North Sea. Could you talk a little about that, and Taichi, any thoughts about sort of Japan's growing interest in hydrogen or ammonia would be really interesting as well.
Yes. Actually, the IHI, our company, is also developing the ammonia combustion technologies, and actually, the comparing to the hydrogen itself, the ammonia is easier to handle. So that is one of the reasons we are developing eagerly for this. So especially the hydrogen itself is neither the very low temperature to storage in the tank. So but the ammonia is the relatively easier. So that's why. And so the conversion in the boiler, so for example, so we can use the hydrogen and or ammonia with some coal or the oil or some other some other fuels. So we can mix them so to reduce the fossil fuel. Also, this is what what is done in Japan in many power plants these days.
Gear, did you want to?
Yeah, just there are basically three projects that we are evaluating in this space right now. And I stress evaluating because it is early days. One is precisely the Magnum project, where we're partnering with Vattenfall and Gazuni. And the whole point of this is to convert a gas power plant to run on hydrogen. Then we have something called the H21 North of England project in the UK. And this is a project where 3.7 million homes and 40,000 businesses in northern England could be converted from gas to hydrogen heating. We presented a feasibility study to the authorities last November, and we'll have to see how that process proceeds. The third aspect of what we're doing in the hydrogen space at the moment is that we have a dialogue with ship owners around how to best evaluate the utilization of hydrogen as a fuel in the shipping or maritime sector.
That's really interesting. Is that driven by new IMO standards as well? Just a quick follow-up on that last one, because it piqued my curiosity, Gear.
Possibly.
Yeah. A strong answer. Let's go back to the audience real quick. Do we have some other questions out there that anyone else wants to ask? Yes, we have one question up here for this gentleman.
I'm Robert Sokolow. 45Q comes in and out of the conversations. It seems to me that we're a year in now. It must be possible to figure out how well it's doing and to start framing the amendments or the modifications or the weak spots that need to be attended to, and come out of a meeting like this with some momentum toward 45Q or 45Q. What would be the elements?
So the question from Dr. Sokolow, and thank you very much for asking it, is we've had this conversation for quite a while, actually. And with 45Q, we have a real opportunity to hone this policy tool, to amend it, to shape it in a way where it is most effective and also most sustainable and cost effective for the public balance sheet, because after all, it is a tax incentive. What do you think are some of those things which could be done to shape 45Q? What are we learning about it, and how best to hone that sort of policy mechanism going forward? Kurt, do you want to start off with that?
Sure. Well, it sounds sort of nuts and bolts, but the first thing that has to happen is Treasury has to come out with an implementation rule so investors in Wall Street know exactly what the rules are. Until that happens, no one's going to invest anything. What that means is that I'm hoping in this quarter or the next quarter, Treasury is going to put out a rule that guides what's a safe harbor for the tax credit, exactly how the tax credit can be claimed under IRS rules, and that will be like a starting gun for investors. They'll have the certainty they need to make investments. So that's an administration step. We anticipate that's going to happen, and once that happens, we hope to see projects formally announced. What could we do to tweak 45Q? I think I'm not sure if I'd call it a tweak, but one of the most important things that ultimately needs to happen, I think, with the provision is the window in which you can claim the credit, the commenced construction window. works well for probably for industrial sources that can build more quickly, but for power plants, which tend to have a four to 5 year time frame to really go from the drawing board to begin construction, that 5 year commenced construction window is pretty tight. And if there were some extension on that, that would be really important. We really need CCS applied to both sectors, the industrial sector and the power sector. And I think the power sector is kind of at a disadvantage right now with the way the law is currently structured.
Lynn, I want to get your thoughts on that as well, really looking at these technology developments on the ground.
Well, I just wanted to pick up one thing that I agree with that was said. We've seen, where I'm from Pennsylvania, but in Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, when we had the Marcellus and subsequently the Utica gas shale revolution, we saw major impediments to drill rigs. And again, to the timing issue, I'm not so concerned that it can be done, it can be planned out. I'm very concerned about the EPC firms when everyone is, and actually the equipment manufacturers. That is where I think the real concern is. These are very large projects. I mean, to put this into perspective, if we've all seen Petronova and other pictures of Boundary Dam. But even tests that we do, what we call small scale pilots, which are 1 megawatt. So for a power plant that might be 800 megawatts, if we do a 1 megawatt test, the absorber that's used to remove the CO2 is 150 feet tall. Now, it's not likely going to get taller the larger we go. The diameter, it will get wider, and we might have multiple trains. But I mean, that is a huge amount of steel that we're talking about. It's a huge amount of transportation if you're not barging it and you're trying to ship it, DOT issues. All of those things make the timing, as I said on my opening comments, the time is now, and it's very critical. And so I think as we all kind of sit back and wait to get clarification, I suspect, and I've talked to others, people aren't really sitting back and waiting because they realize we can't wait. They're trying to do as much as they can do, even without the guidance and the clarification.
And just for our audience, what's the cost of the average, let's say if we think about the kind of CCS project that's going to be needed to actually deliver the sort of reductions envisioned in Ipcc reports, what's the average cost of an average, let's say, power sector CCS project? Are we talking on the order of $500 million, $1 billion? What are we most likely looking at?
I apologize. I can't give you that number.
I can sort of.
I can give it to you on like a 50 megawatt. Smaller.
Right. You're at the leading edge, so that's understandable.
It could be as high as $500 million. That's kind of a moving target. Technologies are developing that could substantially reduce that number, but we're sort of where wind was back in the 80s when projects were first getting built. We're in the process of really understanding what the cost curve looks like, but $500 million for, say, a coal plant retrofit is certainly a number that's plausible.
So, Lynn, yeah.
And just to that point, DOE and others in the room, we often talk about first of a kind and nth of a kind, the first built and the nth built. So when we talk about how much does it cost, we want to talk about the nth, but the problem is so much cost reduction comes from learning by doing. And so in order to get to the nth of a kind, you have to have the first, the second, the third, then maybe eighth. I don't know what nth is, but something less than 10. Well, think about it. On power especially, we have Boundary Dam, and now we have Petronova. We are nowhere near the nth of a kind. So to even give a cost, but the good news of that is that I believe there's a lot of room for improvement, and we know that each time we build, we've heard CanSolve say publicly and Boundary Dam say publicly, they believe the next time they build their second, not their nth, but their second, they believe there could be, I think it was upwards of a 30% reduction in cost. So we realize that that's happening, but again, that is why we need more and more of these to get to what the real baseline cost will be, the true nth of a kind cost.
That's an excellent point. And it makes me think about the experience that we've seen in other clean energy technologies, in particular more mature ones like like wind and solar, that it took a number of years before you started to get interest from institutional investors, because it took a while before they really felt comfortable in how they could model a diversified portfolio of different wind and solar assets and then be able to say comfortably, we've got a really consistent rate of return on these. It matches up with, let's say, our pension liabilities as a pension fund or something like that. Do you imagine that eventually we'll get to the point where CCS projects, CCS investments might be similarly attractive to institutional investors? And regardless of whether you can predict the future like that, do you think that's an important step that we need to get to?
Yeah, I'll immediately jump on that. I absolutely think it's an important threshold to get to. How many projects we need to build, or how many gigawatts, or how many tons we need to store, I'm not sure. But there's been some interesting literature looking at the history of technology evolution, and when technologies produce about a 1% of primary energy production, that's a period where they begin to diffuse more throughout the energy system. If you take that number, that's the equivalent output of like 200 gigawatts of nuclear. So you really have to get to a significant scale, almost to the scale where wind is today. CCS needs to be at that scale where we think it's so obvious how to put a deal together that there really is no additional risk from an investor perspective. So it's probably well beyond. Nth of a kind might get you certainty on technology costs, but for the risk of actually putting deals together, it's a much bigger number.
Excellent. Let me go back out to the audience.
If I may just
please,
pick up on one point on 45Q. We are as enthusiastic about these types of incentive structures as I think the rest of the panel is. As we develop our business in the US, we're looking at ways in which we can utilize potentially such schemes. One issue in particular I wanted to mention is that we are doing some pilot testing with a liquid CO2 in the Bakken area in North Dakota. Now, this is an area that is not lacking in coal and other resources, especially if you broaden the geography a little bit. But it so happens that in order to get the CO2 we need for this fracking operation testing, we need to bring it from Canada, 1,000 miles away, partly by pipeline and partly by truck. Now, you can imagine if you were able to create a CO2, either regional or local hub, from which you could source that kind of the amount of CO2 that you needed. You would have a steady supply, and you would bring the cost down tremendously. I'm not saying that this is where we are going in the Bakken, but it is certainly an example of the paradox of having CO2 not too far away, but still not being able to tap into it because of a lack of the kind of infrastructure you would want. And I think this is the problem we're facing, not just in the Bakken, but in many parts of Europe as well.
So it's truly about a comprehensive model that works with all the pieces fitting together. I saw a question from our fellow Branko Terzic, so I'd like to go to him in the front. We've got another one of our Atlantic Council fellows that we'll follow up with as soon as he's done. Branko.
Thank you. Working. Thank you. I'll try one more time. I'm Branko Terzic with the Atlantic Council. When we're talking about cost, we're talking about the cost of a large chemical treatment plant sitting next to the power plant. We're talking about thousands, hundreds, dozens of miles of pipeline under the assumption that by accident the power plant is not sitting on top of a sequestration site. And then we're talking about a field where the CO2 will not leak. My question is there any oil company that's ready to sign a contract with the government that says if they put CO2 in for enhancement, it won't leak? Because a 5% leak in 20 years, it's all out in the atmosphere. So, do we forget that important component?
Yeah, I can certainly speak to the last one. I think the clearest indicator of your question on that is what you can go online and look at EPA's website and track this. The companies that have gotten approval under the greenhouse gas reporting rules subpart are reporting mechanism. So that's the mechanism by which you can determine whether or not your CO2 is determined stored by the EPA. Occidental, Exxon have recently received those. Occidental for an oil project, Exxon for a acid gas injection project, and even a very small oil company in Texas on the Lower Peninsula, probably about as far opposite of Exxon as you could possibly get, also received that. So I think they are at least prepared to, once I think the Treasury rules come out, those companies are positioning themselves to effectively guarantee that they're storing their CO2 in exchange for getting that tax credit. So I think the short answer is yeah, they are.
Gear.
Yes, I think we talk about converting storage or potential storage into bankable storage. And that, in order for that to happen, you need to have a proper understanding of the geology of the reservoir structures, both with regard to what the reservoir actually contains, how much it can hold, with regard to injectivity, and with regard to sustainability, how much you can actually keep in the ground. And I think along all those three dimensions, what we have seen over 40 plus years, in our case 20 plus years on the Norwegian continental shelf, but in the US for much longer, is that this is a safe way, as safe a way of storing as storing natural gas in underground storage in the United States or somewhere else in the world. So we don't see any differentiation between that, and we wouldn't see this as a potential business model for us, the storage and transportation part, if we didn't think that it could be done safely and reliably, assuaging all stakeholders, including those who may have some questions about this at the outset.
Is this an area where policy is really going to matter, and you're going to see major differences across geographies? Do you all think on the storage question and on how kind of liability is assessed over time on storage, or do you expect to see in 10 or 20 years from now a fairly homogeneous landscape in terms of the attractiveness of different geographies for carbon storage?
Well, I would say that raises some broader questions. So in terms, first of all, I think we've talked a lot, you talked a lot about the cost of the technology, but a key barrier is the know-how of managing CO2 in the subsurface and the experience of building pipelines. So for example, I think Jeff mentioned earlier that China has 30 CCS projects, and we've been working for almost a decade in China on CCS because I think it's important for basically China has, as I mentioned before, 1,000 gigawatts of coal plants. They have 270 million tons a year of emissions from coal gasification, and through One Belt, One Road, they are becoming a supplier to the developing world. So if they don't know how to do CCS at scale, we've got a real problem with the climate. But they don't have significant experience in CO2 management. They're just developing that with EOR. They don't have any supercritical pipelines that they've developed. One of their major projects, Sinopec Shanli project, is now seriously looking at the first supercritical pipeline. That's very crucial. It's also very incremental. And so we need to have more U.S.-China collaboration on those types of issues. And I think to specifically answer your question, every geologic area is going to be different, not just within countries, but not just between countries, but within countries. And so I think there are some best practices that can be applied regardless of the area that we need to ensure are in place if we want to ensure secure geologic storage. our view is we have a pretty good system in the U.S. right now. We think that fundamentals of that can be applied broadly, so I think it may vary to some degree, but we certainly need to make sure we're doing a mass balanced approach toward ensuring CO2 stays in the ground. We need to be applying monitoring standards that are appropriate for the formations, and I think all of those things can be put into a best practices kind of approach.
Terrific. Lynn, do you want to join in on that?
Well, and again, not to steal my colleague's thunder, but the storage program, that's exactly what DOE has been doing for the sister program. They've been developing best practices manuals, guides. The idea behind the regional partnerships was to look at the different geology in the United States. We're kind of blessed and cursed that we have a lot of different geology, but the point is to understand what the unique characteristics are, what kind of MMV works where, and why it doesn't work other places. That is what we've been doing for 15 years under the geological storage program within DOE.
Terrific, thank you. I see a question from Bob Icord there. As we get the microphone to the gentleman in the red tie right there, if you also have a question, please keep up your hand. I just want to see if there are any others we're going to pick up. Okay, please go ahead, Bob, and then we'll have a question right behind you.
Thank you very much. At our recent Abu Dhabi Global Energy Forum, we heard from a company was working on oxyfuel conversion to both ammonia and to methanol. You talked a little bit about the ammonia work that's going on fuels, but obviously methanol is a big market. I think $100 billion or so is projected. And China and others have been looking at methanol from both coal and et cetera. And some people think that it's more efficient than hydrogen in some respects in terms of fuel. So I appreciate any comments on where you think that stands, what projects are going on that looks at CO2 capture related to methanol.
Great. So let's hold that 1 second. There was a gentleman right behind him in the scarf. Yep. Let's take his question, and then we'll go to the panel.
Hi. Thank you. I'm Matthias Jochum. I'm with one of the EU delegations. My question also concerns hydrogen production, and specifically your views on the possible competition which we can expect for bulk hydrogen production of sort of electrolytic production from renewable, from excess renewable electricity generation versus approaches such as steam methane reformation with CCS. And do you think we're at a point where we need to sort of push for one over the other because of these sort of large-scale infrastructure investments which are going to be required? Or perhaps do you think that these are quite complementary technologies? Thank you.
So two terrific questions. We have one on methanol, and we have another on the different pathways for generating hydrogen, and whether we can afford to kind of go down both simultaneously, or whether we really need to commit a large infrastructure development program around one particular hydrogen pathway. Who wants to take that first? Sure, Kurt, why don't you lead us off?
Sure. This is probably an answer that a lot of people would be irritated with, but with methanol, it has got a C in it, so it's got carbon, it has carbon emissions. That's why we care about climate. That's that's our primary focus. That's why we care about hydrogen and ammonia. There are legitimate questions about life cycle issues and the degree at which methanol can reduce emissions. There are lots of things wrapped up in that, but that's my very unsatisfying simple answer on that. On the second question, again, from our perspective, we really care about is getting to the point of the planet where we're decarbonizing the global energy system, which means that it's got to be affordable around the world, especially in the developing world. So today's steam methane reforming with CCS is the cheapest way to do that. We think it'd be great to have a horse race between nuclear and CCS and renewables, and electrolysis, it works for all of them. There's some interesting questions about nuclear and waste steam and hydrogen, how that might work. There's some interesting ideas about lower capital cost electrolysis, which are interesting. So I don't think it's either or. I think anything that we do to move forward to develop the hydrogen / ammonia system really can serve multiple primary energy production sources and get at really hard to reach emission sources that we may not be able to get any other way.
Terrific. Does anyone else want to take on either that methanol question or the hydrogen question? Daiji, perhaps you have some thoughts on kind of how Japan is pursuing hydrogen infrastructure and where you think carbon capture might or might not fit into that.
Yeah, actually, the hydrogen. Japan has also that some problem with constructing the infrastructure for hydrogen, and so but yeah, so I'm not the in charge of this kind of hydrogen infrastructure things, but yeah, I feel so. The most of the companies should is so trying to develop, but so there is a difficulty. I feel that so. But so the government is saying some solution, but yeah, this time I'm not sure there is some gap between the companies and government's policy.
I should mention as well that some of you may have questions about the global status of CCS report, which Jeff presented earlier, or you may have questions for Assistant Secretary Winberg. He has generously stayed with us for the duration of this event, and we can swing a mic here up front to both of those gentlemen. So if you do have a question which is less oriented to the panel and more oriented to the discussions that took place a little bit earlier in this event, please feel free to do so. We have one question. Yes, the young lady in the back.
Hi, my name is Youngkyung, and sort of going back to like the policy of energy realism and in general like addressing all of these cutting edge technologies, where do you see the greatest potential for R&D across all of these sectors, across all of these countries, and yeah, across the public and the private sector? Thank you.
Great. A question about R&D, and I might add on to that as well, perhaps for Assistant Secretary Winberg. What role you see different international collaboration mechanisms like mission innovation or like the Clean Energy Ministerial or others, are those sufficient mechanisms to facilitate R&D collaboration, or do you think we're in need of new institutions or new mechanisms to manage that international collaboration? Why don't we get a microphone right over here.
First, on the institutes, it seems to me that a new institute pops up about every 6 months. So I think we have a full suite of institutes, and probably what we need to do is get beyond the talking stage and get to the doing stage. So from my perspective, for those of you that have institutes, I apologize, but I think we need to get about doing it. On the question of sort of the broad question of R&D, I think within the fossil energy space, and I'll address that first and then maybe more broadly the DOE space, but within the fossil energy space, clearly reducing the cost of CO2 capture absolutely has to be done. To make this commercially viable. Perhaps if you get to $100 or $150 a ton CO2 tax or credit or whatever, maybe you can live with $50 or $60 a ton capture cost, but that's going to have some pretty negative effects on economies around the world. So getting that cost down, absolutely critical. There's another reality, energy realism, and I alluded to it in my comments, and that is that at least through 2050, IEA says we're going to have 80% of energy consumption around the world is going to be fossil energy. So While many would like to write coal out of the future, I don't think that's going to happen. And so we need to get about the task of the next generation of coal-fired power plants, because developing and underdeveloped countries are going to utilize resources and energy assets that they have underneath their feet. And so we can take a very positive step moving that forward. In the broader space, the energy grids in developed countries are evolving with the advent of more and more intermittent renewables. That raises questions on reliability and resiliency for the grid. We've got not only resilience and reliability, but we also have power quality. We don't talk much about power quality, but we need to, because 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, we didn't have all the sensitive electronics that we do now. So power quality is very important. That gets into reliability and resilience. They're all tied together. And so baseload generation is important. And my colleagues in the Nuclear Energy Office of Nuclear Energy are focused on small modular reactors because the grid's evolving and we need smaller, modular, more distributed power generation. So that's another area. Within DOE, there's quite a bit of funding that has been appropriated for renewables, and I expect that will continue. So at least in the U.S. energy space, I think we could use considerably more funding and effort on baseload power generation. That's nuclear, coal, and to a lesser degree natural gas. And I can speak for the U.S. I won't speak for other countries. Thank you.
Terrific. I want to go quickly to Jeff, and then we'll turn around to our panel because they may have thoughts on this as well. Jeff, do you have some thoughts on kind of those R&D priorities?
Yeah. So just a couple of kind of non-technical comments on the question about technology. First, as we're talking to folks around the world, not just in the United States but around the world, what's really fun to watch is the amount of excitement that particularly young entrepreneurs have about capturing carbon and doing whatever with it, right? And there's these guys that are wanting to save the world, and they're doing it one step at a time. 1 ton, 500 pounds of CO2 at a time. So there's an enormous amount of innovation that's kind of starts from the heart, but these are folks with PhDs that know what they're doing. So that's a lot of fun to watch. The other thing I would say about innovation and technology development is there's this. There are two paths that are moving forward in parallel. One is this incremental improvement to existing technologies. And we're seeing the costs come down incrementally on a technology that kind of exists, and it's getting better and better all the time. The solvents are getting better, the physical layouts are getting better, and that's kind of one path that's going on. But at the same time, there's these folks that are thinking about completely different ways of thinking about how to capture CO2. Net power is a really good example of that, right? So they're saying, well, let's generate electricity and capture the CO2 at the same time. In fact, let's use that CO2 to generate electricity. And that's really fun to watch as well. So, myself, I don't know which is going to win. I think both is really important. I think they're both going to be winners, and they're going to be both part of that solution that we have to address climate change. But there's several advances that are occurring at the same time. Lynn was talking about how tall the tower needed to be to capture, to strip CO2, right? Well, we've got a company that's actually one of our members, Carbon Clean Solutions, that said, well, it doesn't need to be that way. What if instead of using gravity as the primary force to strip CO2, let's get an accelerator? And so they've got a box that's about 3 feet by 3 feet, and they're doing that capture in there. So there's all this really interesting innovation that are just breaking the rules and figuring out a new way to do it. And we're seeing that all around the world, and it's just a lot of fun to watch.
Lynn, I saw you ready to give an answer on this as well. Daiichi, maybe you could hand her the microphone, and she could
Thank you.
give us her thoughts as well.
Oh, I think I'm working. So I wanted to just mention the baseload power and the importance of the grid reliability. I'm sure everybody knows in the United States anyways that this week we are going to break records that we haven't seen for 3 decades. Now they're calling it the polar vortex. We all know that a few years ago we had polar vortex 1, so maybe this is polar vortex 2. But again, it is going to be critically important to do a post-mortem what happens this week when we see temperatures of -50, -40, -30. To the technology question, for a long time, the world has been working on carbon capture and trying to bring the costs down, and they've worked really on the parasitic part of it. And DOE, along with others, have made great progress in decreasing it with advanced solvents, with advanced processes to really bring the parasitic side down. But the problem is, as we bring the cost of the parasitic part down, the capital cost has remained. So I think we really need to concentrate and focus on the CapEx of these processes. To that end, additive manufacturing, and you know, there's not a day that you can't find 50 different articles on additive manufacturing. We are pursuing within DOE ways to make smart packing using additive manufacturing, which can then translate into much smaller absorbers for solvent-based systems, which then give you cost reductions. And along the same lines, simulation-based engineering has literally exploded in the last decade, and it can benefit all areas of science, but I think it's particularly important with regards to carbon capture. There are just so many new material discoveries made on a daily basis, and we can't possibly look at all of them. But simulation-based engineering can help us screen the materials that are out there and find the one that is going to be most optimal. And that's on the material side. So whether it's a solid sorbent or a brand new membrane material or a solvent, but simulation-based engineering can also be applied on the process side as well, as can additive manufacturing. So in my opinion, those are the two really, those are the two things that I think we're going to see breakthroughs in the next decade that lead to significant cost reductions for carbon capture as well as other industries.
I want to touch on something that both Assistant Secretary Winberg raised, but has also been echoed on this panel. But I really want to bring it front and center here as we get towards the end of this session, which is, although a lot, I mean, all of us, you know, on stage and a lot of the discussion here today has been focused on really developments in advanced economies. The lion's share of future emissions that we have to deal with are going to be in emerging markets. They're going to be in the developing world. What is the current status and what are the future prospects for technology transfer of carbon capture, storage, and utilization to emerging markets in the developing world? How is that technology going to be transferred? And perhaps as well, if if there is an exciting development that you see in India and in China that you want to highlight, I'd like to give you that opportunity here now today as well.
So I feel like my background before CO2, I was involved with mercury, and we control mercury emissions in the United States, and sulfur before that, and NOx. And I kind of feel like CO2 is a little bit of a different animal, because in the past, developing countries were not necessarily where we were. So we could develop a technology, we implemented the technology commercially, and then years later, the developing countries were ready to procure it. As we said, this is a global problem. Me personally, and maybe I don't have my DOE hat on, maybe this is my personal opinion. I'm not sure that China, for example, I'm not sure that we will actually export technologies to China, because I think China is in the game. They're looking at technologies as rapidly as we are, and they can develop technologies. Now that's not going to be true for all developing countries. So I do think that there's a market there, but it is certainly not lost that at least the new market for power in this country. But I think also industrial, there is opportunities in the United States for industrial that are going to continue to be opportunities, and might, particularly with our shale gas revolution and our cheap fuels, might become even more opportunities than we see now for technologies on carbon capture.
Thank you very much. Kurt.
Yeah, I would like to, I agree with pretty much all of that. The one thing I would like to do is start a campaign to eliminate the term technology transfer, because I think it conveys the idea that we do develop these ideas in the West, and eventually out of our largest, we give them to the rest of the world at some discounted price. But I look at Clean Carbon Solutions, which were Indian engineers that did their test bed in the US and did their first commercial pilot in India. That doesn't sound like technology transfer. That sounds like technology development on an international basis, which is what most commercial, global commercial businesses are like today. And I think that it's true that the technology could very well develop in China, but we've also seen in China that while they're developing and using their own gasification technologies, they buy from GE and they buy from Siemens. The key metric is really getting the cost of the technologies down so they're used by the countries as they electrify their countries and bring energy access to their citizens. We really need to focus on the cost metric, not a technology transfer metric.
Interesting. And I wonder as well, going along with that, I'll sign up to your referendum to stop using the word technology transfer, at least to stop using it in conventional ways. I wonder as well if China will not only be the source of technologies which will be deployed within China, but if the United States down the road will increasingly find itself perhaps in competition with Chinese technologies in third country markets, perhaps throughout South and Southeast Asia as well, where you do see still a lot of coal, a lot of fossil plants being deployed, which are going to have long lifetimes that we have to grapple with. Lynn, is that the case of how you see the future as well?
I believe so.
Okay, interesting. Let me take just 2 or 3 more questions, and then we're going to wrap things up here today. I want to make sure that we continue to treat our audience well. So yes, we've got one question in the front here. Please.
Sure. Jeff Epping with Energies LLC. Thanks for the comment. Shifting the gear a little bit from technology to policy, in the States we have renewable portfolio standards, which really picked a horse in the renewable sector. Is there a role for the states in CCS? Is it totally a federal endeavor?
Terrific question, and maybe we'll actually end on this one. I want to take advantage of that to throw just a little bit more on it, which is that question: is there a role for states? What's the balance between state and federal policy? And if you wish to add on to that as well, what is the one additional thing you would like to see over the next 5 or 10 years that could really help to drive momentum in CCS and get us to where we need to be in 2025, 2030?
So, is there a role for states? Yes. Would a CES potentially help? Sure. I mean, in combination, the Wind PTC with our renewable portfolio standards was a pretty powerful combination in getting that technology deployed. The one thing it didn't do was it didn't drive much advancement in the technology. And so the one thing that I would like to see, in addition to what we have now, would be an incentive that really helps bring those technologies further back in the pipeline, the ones that could really reduce the cost of the technology, down from starting with getting them to the first of a kind project to the nth of a kind project. 45Q helps with that, but it's really not that kind of incentive. You need, and as we've seen with the wind, previous history in wind, you need something that juices those technologies to get them to the valley of death. I don't think we have that yet.
Thank you. Lynn.
I think that there certainly is a role for states. I think the role for states right now, the most glaring role, in my opinion, is actually on the storage side. So there's states like North Dakota have been leading the way when they're doing Class 6 permitting and things like that. And really, we need to be at the end before we can really start at the beginning. So Texas and others, but we really need to see that across the board. EPA can do the minimum standards, but ultimately the states, DEPs or DERs or DNRs need to also take the lead.
Departments of Environmental Protection, Natural Resources,
yes,
Energy Policy,
whoever,
et cetera.
yes.
Got it.
This is kind of answering your question, but it's a little bit of a personal issue that I wanted to pick up on. Jeff ended with, and I was very grateful, with in 2018 we saw a lot of information about carbon utilization as well as carbon turned into products, CO2 turned into products, as well as CDR, carbon air capture and such. And I just want to say that I think that is probably where we're going in the next 10, 15, 20 years. But I want to say I think that is the time frame where we should be going there. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of concerns. We know that this is expensive. R&D for this is expensive. Commercial deployment is even more expensive. And I have a lot of concerns with all the interest that we're seeing for utilization, all the interest that we're seeing for air capture. I think it's an important piece of the puzzle, but I think both of those are very small pieces of the puzzle I think they're complementary to EOR and or geological storage. And with limited resources or only so many pieces of the pie, I'm very concerned that in the US we could be competing. And I think the other thing is, because of the smaller quantities that you're talking about in contrast to overall geological storage and or EOR, the life cycle for both of those becomes critical. And everybody has an idea, and a lot of those ideas don't pass muster with regards to life cycle. So that's one of the things that DOE is really trying to do. We have a huge group working on life cycle assessments, both on utilization and then subsequently into carbon negative technologies or air capture type technologies. So I think that's where we're headed, and I think it's important, but I think we need to do it in a rational, logical order.
Terrific. Are there any other final closing thoughts? Daiichi?
For the carbon capture in the U.S. is I think the most feasible comparing to the other places in the world. So that is why we are eager to see look at the U.S. market because the U.S. has some oil places like 4 EOR, and then that is in terms of the good in terms of economy, the speculation. So so that means the United States has a good basis for developing the CCS technologies. So this is what I feel. So
thank you. And Gear, you already mentioned a couple of exciting developments, including some potential prospects of using liquid CO2 in the Bakken and some others. And so maybe I'll ask you if you're going to double down on that idea that what we really need to see is carbon pricing to take off, and that would be the single best development over the next decade or so.
No, I was going to end on a much more somber note. I participated in several discussions of this kind in Brussels between 2008 and 2010. And for that reason, something that was said at the outset of when the report was presented resonated with me. 2018 may well go down as the year when the stars started to again align for CCS. I'm not sure we have made good enough use of the last decade. And we certainly cannot continue with that kind of pace if CCUS is going to be part of the arsenal with which we tackle the climate challenge. So I think time is of the essence, and there have been some positive movements on the policy framework side. We from industry, we need to do our job on the business model side of things, but we have to remember that we need wide deployment, especially in the period from 2030 to 2050, and it takes 4 to 8 years to develop these projects. So, it's long overdue that the stars align.
An eloquent and a thought-provoking way to end an excellent session today. Before I ask you to join me in thanking the panel, I just want to wrap up by saying one of the biggest takeaways for me personally in working with the Global CCS Institute to put this together, I thought we were going to hear far more about competition, but what I came away with was the sense that instead, when the United States, just to use the country that we're in here today, works together with the rise of CCS R&D, with the rise of CCS innovation and deployment in other parts of the world, U.S. leadership is not diluted, but instead U.S. leadership is magnified. So if perhaps if there's one thing, we need to rethink the nature of competition and the nature of leadership, particularly when it comes to carbon capture and storage. When the challenge is so great, we need more international collaboration and cooperation and sensible partnerships more than ever. So on that note, please join me in thanking this illustrious panel, in thanking the Global CCS Institute for their help with this, Assistant Secretary Winberg, and please join us outside now for a little aperitif and canapé reception to thank you for being such great audience today. Thank you very much.